relax and enjoy the 2023 TCBES Symposium. And for our first speaker, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jonathan Price. Many may know as JP. I've had the wonderful pleasure of taking 3 extraordinary classes with him, and it's just been a magical mystery tour of wonderful plants native to the islands, and learning about biodiversity, learning about Hawaii's landscapes, and just thinking about things in completely new ways. So I'm honored to be introducing him, and you guys are in for a huge treat.
Okay.
Wow, that's a lot of expectations. I don't know whether I need to bring the magic or the mystery. Okay, aloha kako. And I'm going to be talking about creating reference communities for conservation efforts by modeling dominant plant species across Hawaii. And I realize that's a very long title. And so a better way maybe of thinking of it is, there we go. How restoration ecology is like gourmet cooking. Don't need to go into the various ways that land has been converted and changed in Hawaii, transformed by severe invasion, urban development, degradation by grazing, or in some places like Kaho'olawe here at the bottom right, complete conversion to a lifeless landscape in the worst possible cases, right? So the ideas of ecological restoration, in some senses, are trying to undo some of these, some of these processes that have really wounded the land. And we can think of, some of these, wonderful forests we have. This is a forest in Ka'u, and you can see, lovely forest of ohia trees, and then an understory with a variety of ferns and these wonderful ha-ha plants. But the question is not everywhere it looks like this, right? We have a lot of places from that last slide that look quite different. And ecological restoration is trying to change that, right? So step 1 of our cooking experiment here is decide what to cook. In other words, where are we going to focus our effort? What are we going to restore? Underrepresented communities, there's certain communities where we don't have very much of it left, like lowland dry forest, for example. Habitat for the rarest species. Sometimes those are in rare habitat types. Sometimes they're just in the right places. Communities that are threatened by climate change. We know that certain areas, the climate is changing at a faster pace, and those are the places that we want to focus on because they're the ones that are transforming the most rapidly. And we can sort of say, oh, well, okay, well, here's this landscape before humans here, but really have a lot of information about that, right? This was over 1,000 years ago. It was a completely different world. Whereas the world we live in today, on the other hand, gives us limited options for some of these community types to get baseline information. So you can see some of these habitats like lowland dry forest there in the orange. We have very little of it left. And so the question is, okay, well, step 2, how do we assemble the ingredients for that restoration project to put that dry forest back together? We could choose species from the immediate area, but in highly fragmented landscapes, that may not give you a lot of species to choose from. We could focus on species that are likely to have occurred at that site. And we have different ways of sort of assessing that. And yet again, here we go with climate change, species that we might expect to be suitable for that site in a climate change future. So we have a lot of ways that we can sort of think about what ingredients to include. And this has been, okay.
Oh, it's just frozen now.
It's just frozen. Here we go. It's frozen because it's a cold place. This is that ha-ha plant that I was showing earlier. And it grows in these high elevation wet forests, and it has a very thin belt where it occurs, and that's right in an area where it is vulnerable to climate change. And past work with Jim Jacoby and Sam Gahn and others, we've tried to put together ways of saying, well, where could just this occur? Where could it be? And this is a good first cut, but that doesn't give us a whole lot of nuanced information about what kind of a community context it could occur in. And when people are out doing these restoration projects, there's sort of two ends of the spectrum that can occur, right? There's the one end of the spectrum saying, well, we know it was a koa forest, so we have to plant koa trees, right? And then you have, koa trees, but the reality is there are all of these other species in the mix, or these other ingredients that you want to have in there. On the other hand, you could say, well, I just want all the ingredients, as many of them as possible, right? It's going to be a big stew of all of these things. And that ends up being a little bit like a botanic garden where you find, these miracle forests of all of the rarest species in an area the size of this room. And so what we would like to do is to take that next step, which is to measure the ingredients, right? And with cooking, this can sometimes be really important. It can make a big difference. And so we're measuring the ingredients by characterizing structure and abundance in a quantitative way across the landscape. We have empirical data. This is plot data from about 3,000 vegetation plots. So people who have had my vegetation class, that's a lot of vegetation plots. I did not take most of them. And we're using those data from these vegetation plots to say there's this much percent cover here, this much percent cover there, to project out on the landscape a model of percent cover of key native species. And we're doing this for common species. We're looking at rare species as well in a somewhat different way. But in order to process that data, this is actually a huge task, because out of those 3,000 plots, it turns out we aggregated them from different projects. And so we had to go through this big process of standardizing the vegetation cover, which is sort of our metric of how much there is of a given species in that location, standardizing the taxonomy, which these plots include hundreds and hundreds of species, and the species keep changing, which is really annoying, which is why we largely use Hawaiian names for some of these, just because it's easier. They're pa'a. The scientific names keep changing, and we're trying to deal with that. We excluded plots that had more than 33% relative cover of woody invasives. In other words, plots that had more invasive species than really we would be wanting to target for a restoration baseline. The reality is, yeah, we could say we want 100% native. I think we saw yesterday in these lowland dry forest areas, you're not going to get that. And if we have too purist of an attitude, we're just not going to have the information we need to project out. We excluded plots that were subjected to grazing and fire. Of course, that's not what we want as our target or baseline condition. And we excluded plots near the coast in developed areas for a variety of reasons, that there's a lot of human activity in those places. And here's the location of our plots. The ones that we included are in green. The ones that we excluded are in yellow. And you can see we have pretty good representation across the Pai'aina. We have not as many on Kauai as we would like, but I'm working on catching up with that. The Big Island and Maui are maybe a little overrepresented. Here's another way of looking at those data, which is looking at the climate space of Hawaii. Elevation on the y-axis up and down, and then rainfall on a log scale as the x-axis. And you can see in our climate space, first of all, the highest elevations, there's no vegetation or very little vegetation. It's an alpine desert, so we don't have a lot of plot data up there. But you can see we have data from the top of Mauna Kea, which is high and dry. We have lowland wet areas that were collected largely by one of my graduate students, Jaya Tupui. And we have, most of the climate space sort of filled out. What was interesting was we found that we had these donut holes. One of them, most surprisingly, there we go, is right in the middle of the climate space, montane mesic. When we get to older substrates, if you have a montane mesic climate, it has been converted to cattle pasture with very little exception. And we were surprised in our data that we just had very little data from koa forest, which is sort of an iconic forest in Hawaii. We also, of course, had a lot of missing data in the lowest elevations, lowland dry, lowland mesic kinds of areas. We expected that. And so we've been working to fix that. And so these green triangles are some of the data that we've been collecting recently to try and target these gaps in our data. So using those data, maybe I'll just go back. one just to say, when we look at these plots, these are just the locations. We have, let's say, the cover of the measured cover of Ohia, because of course Ohia is going to be in much of this landscape. And we can say, well, there's lower cover up here, there's relatively high cover in the Monte wet zone, and then the lowland dry zone, it's low again. And if we project that out on the landscape using a multivariate model, using climate and substrate parameters, we can get kind of a continuous spectrum of how much percent cover of Ohia we would expect on the landscape. And this is kind of an idea of like under the best possible conditions of forest. This is kind of what we would expect. And you can see some of these areas, not surprisingly, are, in the 50 to 60%, like that's a pretty closed canopy forest. But some of these areas, lowland dry areas, it's still present, but in a lower percent cover, right? And when we use a number of these, and this is sort of our plan, we're not quite there yet, we can go out to a place like Cowho Ranch, for example, which is an active restoration project, and be able to say, layering all of these models of the most, common native species, be able to say, here's your recipe, here's the measurement of the ingredients for your restoration recipe. And you have that percent cover to know to put out this much Ohia, this much Pukeave, this much Koa, etc. Right? So that's sort of the vision. It is very much in process. And but we're hoping that this is going to result in a better recipe for restoration. Of course, the modeling is helping to kind of fill in gaps for habitats that we don't have a lot of information for by extrapolating into those areas for a variety of different species, where we may have little or no data from that immediate area. It's best for relatively common species, or species that are common within a narrow set of environments, like, sort of, let's say, Hala near the coast or something like that. And of course, rare species require a more nuanced approach, and that's another thing for later on. But we're hoping that this is going to be a tool that we can make available to managers to help guide that restoration process with a little more precision and hopefully for a better recipe. And with that, I would like to acknowledge a number of my colleagues at USGS, Jim Jacoby, Lucas Fortini, and Helen Sofair. I'd also like to highlight some of the people who have collected some of the most important data. Allie Ainsworth with the National, or at the time with the National Park Service, Kapua Cabello, who collected huge amounts of data with her team in the Waianae Mountains, giving us the best information about our diverse mesic forests, and who I happen to be an undergraduate botany with. And Anya Tagawa and Jaya Dupuy, a couple of my graduate students, graduates of TCBES, who did a lot of field work, particularly in lowland habitats that otherwise aren't very well represented in a lot of the data that's out there. With that, I will say mahalo and take any questions. Question in the back. Hannah?
These could be extrapolated to other locations.
Yeah, so functional traits are something we're beginning to go into the mix with. What's interesting is we almost would sort of reverse engineer it in the sense that we can look at these, some of these plots and some of these native communities, and then start looking at the functional traits and understand which ones work well together in the best possible circumstances, and then translate that out. So yes, but it's probably a two-step process that's going to have to involve Dr. Ostertag. Question?
You would probably be already.
Yeah, so there's two things. So one, we're expecting, in some of these plots, our projections, are plots that do have a certain amount, up to 33% of these invasive species. The flip side is we can also go into communities that are completely dominated by invasives and model them and say, what is the worst case scenario? Not only for present climates, but also for climate change, right? We want to know where these invasive species might be moving in order to sort of keep them out in some cases if they're not there already. So we're accounting for them, and they actually will be sort of treated in a sort of different way. Yeah, I hope, does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
question.
Sure. Okay, from the chat. Okay, is that it? That is a good question. So very detailed question. For some species, we model the species, the islands separately, only because some species, for example, there's one called Lonamea, which is only on Kauai and Oahu in lowland dry forests. We're not projecting that out to other islands. So that is a species, that's an example of a species specific one. We're also accounting for differences across islands to some degree based on long-term substrate age.
JP, for our folks on Zoom, can you repeat the questions?
Oh yeah, sorry. The question was, are we accounting for species separately on each island? And the answer was, in some cases, yes, where they're endemic to certain islands. And then we're sort of combining data across islands for others.
This is not exactly a line what you think about, but I mean, with these models, are considering to make those plantings successful. So if you have a plant that doesn't have a pollinator there.
Yes. That is, yeah, and that's a next level issue where we combine this with the bird habitats, not only the where they are, but also models of where maybe they're going as far as climate change. And with the lowland dry forest, that's going to be our biggest challenge because we simply don't have native pollinators in the same place where those plants need to be, which is the low dry areas. So that is a complicating factor for sure. Okay. Well, thanks very much, everybody. Oh,
I've got one for you.
Okay.
And if you could repeat this for the folks on Zoom if they can't hear me.
Oh, okay.
So your model's using I'm assuming land cover to look at potential places to do restoration, if I'm correct, right?
Well, the land cover that would be sort of identifying areas that are a target. Yeah.
But how does it take into account, or is it taking into account differences in land use? So you might have a site that would be a really good, it has all the ingredients for a great restoration recipe, but it's privately owned or it's not a place that we can actively manage.
Exactly. So the question is, how do you account for present land use in the selection? In a lot of ways, this is meant to maximize opportunities where we have them. So if we have a place like the Waikoloa Dry Forest, and I work with those folks, that just happens to be an opportunity where we can, plant some of these things out, but there are only certain species that are in the area. And so we work with them to sort of help to decide what might go there based on the opportunity that location affords. So it's less choosing the sites and more about choosing species for the sites.
That's all we have time for.
Okay.
But we've got one in the chat.
If
you want to reply to that, or a couple in the chat.
So it's also from Elliot. Will the modeling only recommend species for restoration areas that were modeled based on endpoints found wild individuals, or are there enough strong species associations that give recommendations on models?
So the question is, can we make recommendations for non-modeled species that have less data? And the answer is that the modeled species will be the ones that are more common. And so that we'll have sort of one set of criteria for those. The rarer species, the non-modeled species, again, that's a separate sort of nuanced approach that gets into a little more detail about, the needs of those rare species, including in some cases pollinators. So,
Mahalo, JP.
Mahalo.
There's more questions in the chat if you want to address them. But I think we should move on. I think our